things out, datasets and classification.
Yes. And it's actually quite nice going after, because most of my or a lot of the things in my presentation are tying into the previous two talks that we've just had. I'm an artist and researcher, and my practice kind of brings together technology, literature, photography, drawing, writing, and tries to sit between the artistic, scientific, and academic. And one of the key things that I'm really interested in is working with abstract collections of information and data, and particularly self-generated datasets, which I'm going to talk a lot about, to create new and unusual narratives in different mediums, and how technologies such as machine learning can use them to translate these stories to an audience. And because of this, and because the first degree I did was English literature and language, so I've always been interested in classification and when a thing becomes a thing and when it stops being a thing. What classification is, how it works, what it does, has always been something that is really core to my work. And this presentation is a kind of like the start of it. I'm trying to bring together some of these ideas that I've had and have been thinking about in relation to some work that I'm going to be starting on and bringing together. And for me, and I'm going to use the definition of classification as being a spatial-temporal or spatio-temporal segmentation of the world. And looking at, to begin with, I want to look at this, which is one of the earliest taxonomies that I could find. Because taxonomies are really interesting, because you have a data set and it's just information, and it's the taxonomy that sits on top of that data set that allows knowledge to be kind of like brought about and brought together. And this isn't something new that started with ImageNet, WordNet. There's been this huge, long desire to classify and codify the whole world. And this is by a 17th century philosopher who constructed a classification scheme which was meant to provide elementary building blocks that could be used to construct the universe's every possible thing and notion. And he constructed the world into 40 broad categories, ranging from God to disease to stones. And then each of these could be subclassified to aid the defining of them. Stones were divided into vulgar stones, middle prized or precious, dissolvable, non-dissolvable, and then vulgar stones could furthermore be subcategorized into greater or lesser magnitude, and so on and so on. And this seems like it's hilarious and ridiculous, but this is actually the basis of the modern thesaurus. So even though this kind of classification scheme seems like it's useless, it ended up kind of having this very kind of foundational impact in linguistics, which is quite similar, I think, to kind of like how WordNet, if you actually start to look at it, it seems like there are all these problems with it, but then it kind of slips into these other systems that then start to build the world. And it was the inspiration, I suppose, that you can call it that, for a brief essay by Borges, which I'm sure a lot of you know. It's called The Analytical Language of John Wilkes, where Borges discusses Wilkins and very quickly dismisses his effort and introduces this completely fictional ancient Chinese list, which supposedly details how animals are meant to be classified, divided according to these very incongruous principles, those which are the property of the empire, those that look like flies from a distance, those which are fabulous but somehow not mermaids, those which are tame, those which are finely painted, and those which are simply not listed. And this draws attention to and ridicules the very arbitrariness and cultural specificity of trying to categorize the world. And if you kind of start to think like that, you're like, well, what is the point of trying to do this? How is it possible? But to classify is human, and you shouldn't kind of say that just because it's impossible it shouldn't be attempted. Our lives are built around systems of classification. We do it consciously and subconsciously every day. And kind of like to move away from this talk of taxonomy and systems of knowledge, but just to think about how it's very much embedded in how we go through the world, kind of in the morning, like sorting dirty dishes from clean dishes, read emails from unread emails, from, you know, I don't know, all of these different things is the way that we make sense of the world. And when you're presented with something new, it's almost impossible not to try and classify it in some way. And from that classification, also make inferences. And in a way, and I've talked to psychology professors, and there is a lot of research around how without classification, we have no memory, because we need to have these tags in order to remember. And without it, there's no way to retrieve information that we know. But for the most part, these standards and classifications, however much they are part of our lives, are ordinarily invisible. And so playing now is a work by the Turkish video artist Ali Kozma, who does a lot of work about documenting human activity in labour. And he filmed, apparently, the fastest bureaucrat in all of Istanbul. Because it's through bureaucracy that these classifications suddenly come out. It's through kind of things like formal classifications come through, we see them with permits, with prescriptions, with forms, and this bureaucracy makes the invisible visible. And once we can kind of start to see it, when it's written down in language or presented to us, it allows us to question and understand it. What are these categories? Who makes them? How can we change them? How do they spread? And the work of making and maintaining and analysing these classification systems, these kind of forms, and it's a very central part of what it is to be in the modern built world, and especially what it is to be in the modern information age. And I think there is a lot of theoretical work that is being done here across lots of different disciplines, across philosophy, across statistics, across history, across anthropology, to try and work out how all of these systems fit together and what it means. And Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Lee have a really amazing book called Sorting Things Out, Classification and Its Consequences. And they argue that for something that is such an essential part of our lives, we're often ignorant of these kind of like invisible and potent entities. Their impact is indisputable and often inescapable. So the examples that they give are how it's really difficult to ignore gender classification when you go and use the bathroom, a public bathroom, or how it's impossible to find a library book if it's shelved under the wrong kind of number. And that they argue that we have a moral and ethical duty to question these systems and what they mean, because each category valorizes some point of view and will silence another. And I think the important thing that kind of one of the reasons why I find this so interesting is that it's because it's so impossible to do, because we will always do it. It's not necessarily bad, but it is a choice, and the consequences of these choices need to be considered. There are kind of like, there's easy to kind of like see how kind of like these classifications have the consequences in the real world. So kind of like the decision by kind of immigration and naturalization services to classify races and classes as desirable results in quota systems that kind of values affluent people from kind of Northern and Western Europe over those, especially poor people from kind of the global South. Or there's the way that there have been decisions to classify students by exam results, gives precedence to certain type of knowledge and kind of renders other invisible. There are all these ways that these classification systems kind of impact the world and how we live. And, oh, this is such a horrible code picture. But just to kind of think about it, how these a lot of the classification systems that kind of like that are still in play now exploded in the late 19th century, where there was this real kind of boom of systems of classification and standardization of modern and scientific institutions. People were classified, measured, and standardized across just about everything, from animals, human races, books, pharmaceutical products, taxes, jobs, disease, across medicine, science, education, government. And one of the reasons that kind of it became really necessary to kind of measure and compare was the way that this was kind of used to drive economy, because you needed to kind of understand where things were coming and how people were behaving. And so there are kind of striking similarities between the choices that were faced by those in the 19th century and what we're doing now in an information age, where everything needs to have a label in order to be retrieved and made and commercialized. And the reason why I've put this picture up is because now algorithms for codification don't resolve moral questions, but they do tend to obscure them. So when you were kind of classifying and seeing things on paper, it's very easy to kind of see the thought system that sits behind how someone kind of comes from one thing to another. But as kind of Nicholas so clearly explained in his talk, when you're trying to work with ImageNet or any of these other large data sets, it's really hard to trace the thought process of how something has ended up being called one term. And I think this way that this kind of like this hiddenness of how these systems sit behind algorithms is something that kind of is necessary to kind of interrogate. I've put in a few projects that I just briefly want to talk about, which are not related to machine learning, but they do kind of illustrate some of these problems with kind of classification and how I've attempted to kind of work with it. So if you have very large-scale information systems, you have the tyranny of structurelessness. I've done a lot of work with WikiLeaks, which there's an enormous amount of information that sits there. There are like 500,000 files in the past year or so that are organized into 37 rough databases. And the website states that it will only upload documents that are of political, diplomatical, or ethical significance. But actually, when it comes down to it, there's huge amounts of personal and private information that has also been published and uploaded, including details of sick children, rape victims, and mental health patients. And this is because only a small amount of information is read by moderators before being uploaded to the internet by the site, which is increasingly described as being needlessly and recklessly invasive by a number of cultural commentators. And so this means that for every top secret presentation, there are also hundreds of thousands of more personal, more smaller, more mundane, everyday stories that have been uploaded and published. HR complaints, gossip, shopping lists, hints of all the lives of the people who've worked in government departments, who for the most part are kind of like middle management or administrative personnel. But it's very difficult to find this information because although there's kind of there, you can search WikiLeaks, but you can't search for anything that is in a PDF or anything that's been uploaded as a JPEG. So I did a project where I went through and I downloaded them all, and I looked through all of this information to find these hidden and personal stories. And then I created a installation that shows this collision of public and private, and made an AR app that kind of like when you hovered over it, it showed these stories that are hidden inside the database. And one of them was a deeply personal love story of a couple who fell in love and then broke up, all of which, and like it has every single piece of information about them. I found out where they lived, where they shopped, kind of like their HR complaints, all of these different things that was all uploaded and put out into the world. And I have very mixed feelings about that, about creating a piece like that. Another project that, again, really quickly I'll talk about It's something where I did a project where I looked at words that would or would not autocorrect on an iPhone. And this is like a seemingly very small thing, but it actually reveals a lot about the mindsets of people who create algorithms. Language is something that it reveals a lot about power and what people think is very difficult. I've always been really interested in dictionaries and definitions because it shows how it really reveals a lot about cultural mindsets, whether kind of like swear words will be included, how different kind of like different things will be defined. And it's, for me, I think the reason why it's really interesting with technology is because for the first time, choices around standardization of language are increasingly being made by corporations rather than academics, universities, who are transparent about their reasoning. And this kind of like ties into some parallels around how aspects of nationhood are being driven or have some control by large corporations. And yeah, so this kind of like I went through to try and find, so I created a little program that kind of like put every single word from the dictionary through, and then it kind of found that there were kind of like three broad categories of words which would not correct. Some were scatological, which you would expect, some were swear words, which you would expect, but others were to do around, had very clear moral judgment by a corporation. So abortion, if it was off by one letter, it wouldn't autocorrect. Homoerotic, if it was off by one letter, it wouldn't autocorrect. And the reason, again, why I think this mirrors what Nicholas was saying is that these systems, there is no record of them. There is no record of like what is good, what is bad, what is seen as being good or bad or neutral. And also, all of the autocorrect systems are very distinct to different languages. So in Spanish, I think it's papillon, which is like slang for baguette, maybe. Like it's a really like offensive word. And it's like that's autocorrected, but not in, anyway, sorry, I'm going off script and getting confused. But the reason why it's important is that you need to have this kind of like legacy and history, and the way that you can kind of look across dictionaries and see how language has changed. More and more people are using their autocorrect as a form of dictionary and the way to kind of understand how language works. And we're going to miss a whole kind of section of that because this just kind of gets updated, pushed to you, and then pulled away. I'm not going to go through ImageNet because that has been done ad nauseum. Not ad nauseum, it was very interesting. And again, this is the kind of visual of beauty for kind of women, and you can see it is kind of like very highly sexualized, highly kind of like young, and then for freak, there are images of kind of Frankenstein-esque people, but there are also images of disabled children. And for me, because I'm really interested in using AI in my work and machine learning, and because I'm also really interested in libraries and archives and finding these hidden things, I am not interested in using a data set that has come off the shelf. For me, it is absolutely pivotal to create my own. So I'm going to talk very briefly about my own project that I did recently, which is, so this is the final piece called Mosaic Virus, which is about tulip mania that swept through the Netherlands and Europe in the 1630s, and it draws parallels between ongoing speculation around cryptocurrencies because the shape and the appearance of the tulip is controlled by the price of Bitcoin. Mosaic is the name of the virus that causes stripes in the petal, which increased their desirability during the bubble and helped cause the speculative prices of the time. And in this piece, the stripes depend on the value of Bitcoin changing over time to show how the market fluctuates. And I wanted to do stuff that was like bringing together capitalism, valuable, tangible, intangible ideas around speculation and collapse from these two different points of history. But in order to make this, I couldn't just Google tulips, black background, stripes. Like, that doesn't exist. So I had to make my own. And I took 10,000 photographs of tulips, and luckily I was working in the Netherlands, so they were very cheap. And the number 10,000 is slightly arbitrary because I went one day to the market and there were no more tulips because tulip season ended and there were only peonies. So even though it's a very digital piece, it's driven by the rhythms of nature. And it was also incredibly, like, it's back-breaking work doing this because I would have to buy the tulips, kind of like strip them from their leaves, just put them in kind of like a little studio that I kind of made, bend over, take the picture, and thousands of tulips are very heavy. Like, you're carrying them around and they're heavy, and there's this real physical part of making a data set that is often missed because, like, when you look at them, even if with the kind of ImageNet project, and they're flickering by, it kind of looks very beautiful and very pretty, and you really forget the kind of like the physicality of making these things. And doing this kind of like inverted the usual process of creating this type of data set, because there's a huge difference between pulling down images of a certain item and taking those photographs yourself, because when you do the latter, you notice different things, and you kind of like you're hyper conscious of the differences between each different flower that you're taking a photographs of, because you don't want them to be too similar, but at the same time you don't want them to be wildly different. And it does drive you crazy. The process becomes almost like craft, and I think a lot about the relationship between craft and art in the kind of dynamic between the data set and the algorithm. And it is like craft because it is repetitive, it's very time consuming, but necessary in order to produce something beautiful that you want. And there really is a skill to it, because if you make a data set that is too big, if there is too many images in it, it becomes, for me at least, the results kind of become too good. And the quirks and oddity that make machine learning, for me, an interesting medium to explore start to disappear. But if you make it too small, it will not have enough information and become kind of flummoxed, producing nothing or one or two variations from the training set again and again and again. And it's very easy to kind of like to forget this. One of the other things that I found when I made it, I tried to make a extremely balanced data set. So I was very good, and I went and I got 20% of each, kind of like of a red flower, of a white flower, of a pink flower. But then when I trained it, it massively overlearned red flowers. So even though I tried to be as balanced as possible with my data set, it kind of like it overlearned like things, and so there's something that is going on inside the algorithm that I can't understand. And because in order to produce my piece, because I knew I wanted it to be, I knew that I wanted the tulip to be controlled by the stripiness, I had to categorize every single photograph by hand. What color it was, what type of tulip, how striped it was, what stage it was in its life cycle. And it is an insane amount of work, and work that is usually hidden. But I chose, after doing it, because I had to do this kind of like act anyway, and I chose to make it a separate work that sits in relation to the video work. And I wanted to draw attention to this active categorization and the human part of it by handwriting each of the labels. Because I wanted to bring out this kind of the messiness of the world and how to accentuate and maintain the sense of human that sits behind this process. And this often leads to a discussion of error. Because there's a tendency maybe to think when using machine learning that it's always correct. But even something as simple as a tulip was really difficult to put into discrete categories, whether it was white or pale pink or orange or yellow. And if it's difficult for something as simple as a flower, like all of the fluffy nouns, it becomes very, very difficult. And the communication, just something as simple or as kind of like as colour is something that has like flummoxed people for a really long time. Carl Linnaeus, who was one of the people who kind of came up with one of the first taxonomies around plants, openly opposed colour as a necessary or desired trait in describing plants, because he thought that paying attention to these outward characteristics would send botanists back into a state of confusing synonyms that his system, his taxonomy, sought to eradicate. And I definitely found that. And one of the things that I also found, which was that when your perceptions would change. So if I was classifying a load of red tulips and there was one that might be red or pink, I would classify it as red. And then I'd come back to it the next day and reclassify it. And so there are all these, I would doubt myself. And also it was really boring. I could only do it for about 4 hours without having to take breaks. And it took a really long time, and I kept on having to redo it and recheck and remake it because I kept on getting wrong, because your mind starts to wander really, really quickly. And then I also just, by printing it and displaying it in this way, so they're kind of all displayed with very tiny magnets, which again, there's a huge amount of labour that kind of goes into kind of like putting it up into that almost perfect grid, is to re-put it back into the real world and give people a way of understanding it in a physical way, because you do experience 10,000 images in a very different way when you're seeing it surrounding you in a room than you do when you're just scrolling through on a thumb drive. And then, just to end, this something that I really like. It's from the UK copyright law. Self-generated data is important either by generating it myself or constructing it like I did from an existing data source like WikiLeaks, or finding it like I did with the kind of like dictionaries on iOS systems. And it becomes like a decisive creative act. It's a thing within my control. And it's the thing that kind of, you don't necessarily need to have a strong coding background in order to kind of really interrogate. And British copyright law considered a database to be a literary work because of the skill that went into it. And I think this is a really lovely way to think about databases and datasets, because by creating them and by working with them, artists and creatives can show an alternative way of engaging with machine learning, one that is neither owned or controlled by major corporations or academic institutions with their biases or ideologies embedded within it, but rather made and constructed from the ground up.